Thank you all for being here, and thanks for that really nice, generous introduction. So thank you to Phyllis and the Women's Studies program, and also, of course, to Randy and Spencer for hosting this exhibition and all the help they've given me getting prepared for this show and these events. And thank you also to Martha Alfonso and her friends who've also been very supportive throughout this process. It was sort of a long road this past year to figure out how to fund and complete this book and also this exhibition. And so thank you also to ETSU's Research Development Committee for providing some really critical support. Okay, so I'm going to end with this body of work, but start from about 2004 when this is after graduate school. As Phyllis mentioned, I went to graduate school in Chicago. I grew up in the Midwest and spent my first 32 years. My claim to North Carolina roots was all of 2 months before my family moved to Michigan. My father taught at Kalamazoo College as a sociology professor. So after I finished graduate school, and I moved from Chicago to Minneapolis and lived there for 4.5 years, and I'm going to start with a body of work called American Stills that I started when I was still living in the Midwest. So this is one of the first images that kind of set this project in motion. It was taken kind of spontaneously while I was on a trip in northern Michigan with my family. We would go to northern Michigan every summer for a week for family vacation. I had my tripod and camera in the car, sort of caught this moment, but it really started to influence a new direction. I had been working on a documentary project in Chicago, actually going out with police officers, and I showed that when I interviewed and did my talk previously, but I'm showing work that's more related to this current project. And I started to more sort of consciously and deliberately make these landscapes within the urban and suburban, suburban and rural areas surrounding Minneapolis, and on trips between Minnesota and my family's house in Michigan. This was my front yard, and I was really inspired by the kind of deep, cold, still winter nights when I was living in Minnesota, and found something very kind of beautiful and haunting. So many of these images were made at night with very long exposures, and I was working with medium format throughout until I arrived at this project, and I'll talk about shooting 4x5 eventually. But the process was very similar, of setting up a tripod and making long exposures and kind of very limited lighting situations. And the kind of work that I was looking at or thinking about, or even consciously and unconsciously influenced by, I think is a tradition that its sort of roots are in the American painter Edward Hopper, and the contemporary photographer Gregory Crewdson wrote a really interesting essay years ago that I actually share with some of my students about Hopper's influence on American artists, filmmakers, photographers, other painters. But kind of what's at the core of that is this kind of minimal space, this sense of solitude, specific use of color, and a kind of sense of loneliness and disquiet. And I think that's the kind of work that was really resonating with me and shaping kind of the moods that I was looking for to make in these images. This is from Minnesota State Fair. And so I did start to weave some portraits into this work. This is in my hometown, Kalamazoo, outside a motel. And I made this image after I moved to New York City in 2005, and shortly thereafter started teaching at the International Center of Photography as a lecturer, and also a number of colleges in the area, Ramapo College, College of Staten Island, and William Patterson University. But in my early years in New York, I really wasn't inspired by the urban landscape in the sense of wanting to make my personal work there. I did a lot of kind of freelance work as a photographer while I was there, but in terms of what, I wanted to continue this kind of image making about these American environments. And so in order to make my work, I would generally fly somewhere for a week and make road trips. I'd rent a car The previous one was actually made in New Orleans shortly after the hurricane, after Katrina. And this image was made outside of Tampa, Florida. And, I was really looking for that mystery and that sense of atmosphere also in Florida. And and looking at, elements of kind of just the vernacular American architecture. This photograph, which I think was the most, the one that was one of the stronger ones in the body of work in terms of what my goals were. This was, I had gone to Florida because of a story about Gibsonton, Florida, which was the off-season dwelling place for circus and carny people. So sometimes my trips were just motivated by an interest in some piece of narrative, something I read. And I drove around, not really trying to literally photograph in a sort of traditionally documentary sense, like that culture, but just the residue that was kind of left in these environments. And I felt like I lucked out on arriving at this farm, just talking to people and driving around and arriving on this farm. And this horse that was actually the daughter of a celebrated show horse was running up and down the driveway. And of all the images I've taken or moments that I remember, this is one of those most kind of powerful and moving moments to be watching this, through my camera. And I read afterwards I did some research about the symbolism of a white horse. And it's both a biblical reference, and it's also, in American folklore, it's an omen of an impending doom. So I think there's both a kind of darker element to this image, but then there's also something that's about freedom and mystery and kind of the American dream. This was shot in Texas. My brother is a political philosophy professor at UT, and so for over a decade, I've been making trips to the Austin area, and also would just rent cars and drive around different parts of Texas, including like Marfa and just other kind of rural areas. And I arrived at this image. There was a sign outside a building in Dripping Springs, Texas, that said Dreamcatcher's Sleep Lab, and I was really intrigued by what that was. And in a sense, these rooms look much like hotels, but what these sleep labs are is to actually provide an environment for people to understand like anxiety and restlessness. So that theme kind of connected to the sense of aloneness and disquiet and anxiety that I was trying to explore in terms of the mood of these images. And this is also an interior of the sleep lab. And this is from a trip in about 2008, going out west, and some of the couple of the books that really influenced what I was thinking about. One was Under the Banner of Heaven, which is about Mormon history and settlement, and another was The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer, which is maybe some of you are familiar with, sort of a true story about Gary Gilmore, who was a convicted felon in the late 70s. And it's really kind of an epic story about American masculinity and crime and justice. And so these are both like very powerful books that I wanted to explore some of these settings. This is actually in Monument Valley in Arizona, near the Four Corners. And though I tend to try to avoid things that are sort of obviously picturesque or known, that I think the inclusion of the cars kind of changed the more idealized or sentimental depiction of the American West. And it also became a metaphor for America and for sort of the collapse of American industrial power, and was actually published in an article on that subject. In this image, connecting to the Executioner's Song, the title of this image is Field of Sad Trees. And there's a passage in that Executioner's Song where Gary Gilmore is in love with a woman named Nicole, and their relationship has fallen apart. And there's a passage talking about how he had written on a tree, he had carved on the tree, "Gary loves Nicole." So this is in Spanish Fork, Utah, and I kind of drove around in a sense of a search for that tree, but it's sort of an impossible search, but it was also kind of a metaphor for failed relationships and kind of doomed love. And this is also out west. This is Bonneville Salt Flats, which is a region that's actually inspired many artists. And you know, many of the land artists, and even Matthew Barney did a piece out here and made one of his Cremaster series. So that was a really interesting, you know, place to, very desolate. So it's definitely attracted with the kind of emptiness and mystery that the West provides. And I'm certainly not alone in that. You know, that's quite a tradition in American photography. And again, I had started photographing people that I found in some of these environments. This is these three young women are in Crawford, Texas, which is the former setting of George Bush's ranch. He no longer has a ranch there, but he used to. And there were a lot of, once upon a time, filmmakers, protesters, and activity in that area. But the town's identity was entirely built on being that George Bush had put them on the map. And so, you know, even in the local diner, it's a very, very tiny town, everything was sort of celebrating that. And you know, I'm interested in visiting conservative spaces, not as a conservative, but as someone who's, you know, exploring America. And this is in my hometown in Kalamazoo, two women that mostly throughout, since when I was, you know, in college, I did make work that was more people in my personal life, exploring my own personal relationships. But pretty much from graduate school onwards, I've almost entirely photographed people that I have some kind of distance with, people that I build relationships with to photograph, not that are part of my personal life. But you know, I try to connect with people and get to know them and understand their story. And this is a couple in Barton Springs, which is a setting in Austin, Texas, that Robert Redford described as the spiritual center of Austin. And there was a lot of controversy about, you know, developers tearing it down. And then this last image in American Stills, I put towards the end because it leads into my next body of work. This is called Teenage Boy, and it was kind of an off-the-cuff portrait of just someone who was so very sort of striking and haunting to me. But it carried into a project that became a focused portrait project, and that's this small body of work called The Ballad of Sad Young Men. So I started this in the fall of 2008, and the significance of that time, to just give you some context, it was the onset of the recession, and it was also when the fall that Obama was running for president. So it was just a very kind of charged time, and kind of the larger American political and cultural landscape. And I started photographing these young men. The song comes from, historically, it was a song that was played in gay bars to talk, Ballad of Sad Young Men, to talk about the vulnerability and uncertainty of adolescence. And so obviously that historically that would resonate with the gay community. And this project sort of operated on several levels for me. One, it's about being young at a time of great uncertainty in America. It was also a reflection for me on my own experiences as a gay adolescent and growing up in Kalamazoo in a Midwestern town in the 80s and early 90s. And I started to, I shot this project on Main Street in Binghamton, New York. I was dating someone who lived in Binghamton and made trips to spend time there. And I would just drive up and down Main Street until I found these young men to kind of reach out to and connect with and ask if they would, you know, be willing to be photographed. And so the focus was both on some of the kind of rebellion, but also the vulnerability that I could sort of pull out or find or connect to within these young men. This one, Jacob, is one of the subjects that I kind of grew the closest to and photographed a number of times. And he was a young, unemployed person trying to find work in construction and struggling and kind of on the edge. And this is the youngest subject that I photographed, whose father fortunately was nearby, or I would have felt a little uncomfortable about asking to photograph him. In this photograph, this work was ultimately in the winter of 2009 exhibited at a gallery called Daniel Cooney in New York City. And it was a two-person show with an artist named Francesca Romeo, who had been photographing her milieu of friends in New York City. She was the owner of a bar called the Mars Bar. And those of you who are familiar with Nan Goldin, her work was in the kind of Nan Goldin vein of photographing the kind of community that on the sort of edge in New York City of young bohemian kind of people. So, but she had much more of a personal relationship with her subjects. So I'll just read the review. These two young photographers approach portraiture from very different angles, but because their pictures are similarly fraught, complex, and compelling, they complement each other nicely. Romeo, whose subjects are mostly friends and lovers on New York's bohemian fringe, combines intimacy and theatricality in pictures that make the most available light, dark shadows, and tattooed flesh. Stauffer photographs strangers, young men she meets on the streets of Binghamton, New York, who appear at once rebellious and vulnerable. This volatile combination is kicked up a notch by erotic tension, but Stauffer is tender rather than confrontational, and her work looks beyond the boy's cool affect to something warmer. So when that project ended, I wanted to continue making portraits, but it was sort of half a year before the next environment revealed itself to me, and I started teaching at William Patterson University in the fall of 2009, one of these adjunct positions. And on one of my first trips up to Patterson with my colleague, we went up to Wayne, New Jersey, which is a suburb of Patterson. We went through Patterson, New Jersey, and the town immediately resonated with me, in part because of its great sense of history, and later understood that it was the first planned industrial city in the United States, developed by Alexander Hamilton and entrepreneurs, and partly was chosen as a setting to be a manufacturing city because it was on a big river called the Passaic River that could power manufacturing. It rose as a silk manufacturing city. And in the later part of the 20th century, it fell into, like many industrial cities, it fell into decline, and that was only increasing during the recession. So there was very explicit economic struggle and suffering, and also for me, a very interesting mix of, I don't think I've ever been anywhere in my life with the degree of racial and ethnic diversity in this very small city, but there were so many different communities coexisting. And so I started taking the bus from New York City, and this project went on for literally 4.5 years. It was a long, hard project to do. And it was in stages. I could mostly work on it during the fall and spring. It was just challenging. I was carrying my camera on my shoulder, and I didn't have a car at this point, so I was just walking and making these street portraits. And they're certainly not off the cuff. It's not what you think of as sort of street photography, in the sense that I was creating these pictures almost as though making a kind of a classical painting or a studio portrait, really considering the composition and spending time with these people, trying to find kind of minimal backgrounds that would sort of suggest the environment. But I don't think of these as much as environmental portraits as being so much about the connection to the subject and their expression. And that was the sort of most powerful part that I was trying to create within the image, as opposed to telling the sort of larger story, what's around them. Though I wanted to also have sort of suggestions of that urban environment. So again, the work that I had done with the young men in Binghamton kind of helped me develop this method of walking up to strangers and saying, I'm working on a portrait series, and I think you'd be an interesting subject, and saying something to try to make this personal, something that I noticed about them. Because there are hundreds and thousands of people in Patterson, but there were only certain people I chose to photograph to kind of identify something that would be personal about why that person moved me, and rather than anybody else. So that was part of the dialogue that would develop. This is Alexei, and I photographed Alexei a number of times, and this second portrait that is in the body of work is now in the Fletcher exhibit. This was years after that first picture I just showed. There's sort of a transition of he had gone through some illness, and I knew he shared some of his story with me, which was that at one time he lived in New York City and worked as a hairdresser, and at that time identified as trans, and had moved back to Paterson and identified later as a gay man. But there's still certainly a kind of an experimentation or expression of, sort of more feminine gender identity. And that was, like a very interesting, what pulled me towards him. And I remember having a conversation. One of the most memorable thing that stands out to me is me asking him, what's it like to be gay in Paterson? Because my assumption would be that it would be very hard. And I remember he said to me, girl, people love me. So it was just like a great, I'll never forget that. And so again, I carried on this project essentially till I left New York, which this project ended in 2014. And it went on for so long with sort of when does a project end? And that's a question for artists, obviously, and partly was circumstantial. I wanted to mention that a couple references that I was thinking about at a more kind of historical or literary level. There's one of the most important ones is to The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which was a novel by a Dominican-American writer named Junot Diaz, who's actually from Paterson. So I read this novel a number of times, and the protagonist of the novel is a Dominican-American adolescent, overweight, kind of sci-fi geek, sort of a misfit. And that kind of misfit theme of, throughout the novel was also, what I was exploring in terms of different kinds of otherness, whether it be about race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality. And so that was part of what was motivating this project as well. This last one that I'm showing, this work for years was very hard to get exhibited, and I submitted this image, this portrait of Kathy, to the, every 2 years there's something called the Outwin Achiever Portrait Competition at the Smithsonian, and it's a show of portraiture in all different media, you can only submit one image. So this was the one that I felt like moved me the most, and I submitted this, and it was accepted as a finalist into that exhibition. And then this is documentation of it being shown at the Smithsonian. And it was very interesting for me and meaningful to have this shown in the context of a show about national identity and the kind of range of people who make up our American social landscape. And then I had other opportunities to exhibit this work as well. I received a grant from in 2012 through Women in Photography, pairing with a photo lab in New York to create a grant that a woman working in photography receives each year. And I got this grant in 2012, which really helped because it was sort of one of the first elements of funding from outside just my own, piecing it together as a struggling adjunct freelancer in New York City. And so even these small grants really helped me, resolve the project. It's also included in a website and a digital exhibition at the Nelson Atkins Museum called Making Pictures of People. And this, some of you anyone who's in my classes, whether it's a Digital 1 class talking about portraiture or a portrait class, I show them this website because it's a great resource for other contemporary photographers as well, like working in portraiture. So there are something like 27 or 28 photographers' bodies of work included on this website. And this is a documentation of the digital exhibition. And then after I had left New York, but then a year later, I also got a grant, or workspace residency, which came with a grant from an organization called Baxter Street Camera Club of New York. And that helped me finish the project in terms of making exhibition prints and getting it framed. And then it was exhibited in New York City for the first time in June 2015. And then finally, I had the opportunity to show it with the gallery that I was working with in New York, Sasha Wolf. And that was in the fall of 2015. And I'll read the review again. The streets of Paterson, New Jersey provide the backdrop for these unusually engaging portraits. Photographed in natural light, in subdued dusty colors, Stauffer's pictures feel like genuine exchanges, never voyeuristic or distanced. If some of her subjects appear wary, they are totally present, looking directly at Stauffer and by extension at us. The portraits of children and teenagers are often arresting. A boy named Jorge stares at the camera with a disarming, steely gaze, but it's the adults who look ready to tell a heartbreaking story or two. So now I'm getting to this body of work that's in this room, upstate. So at this time that I started this body of work, I was about a year and a half into my limited term appointment, which a 3-year teaching position at Concordia University. It was a very interesting experience to be an American, and challenging experience to be American living in Canada. And one thing I discovered really about myself was that my work is so rooted in American themes, American people, American places. So I struggled a lot the first year and a half, like how am I going to continue to make work and what's it going to be about? While I was still living in New York City, I was in a relationship for 6 years, and my former partner and I would spend a lot of time with her aunt in Germantown, New York, which is outside of Hudson. And that's how I discovered this area. And it made such an impression on me, and I figured at some point I would begin shooting work there. But I made myself, finally start shooting, which is sometimes the hardest part, just to start a project, towards the end of the fall of 2005. And I felt like Hudson connects to Paterson. There are differences. It's much more. The Hudson of now is much more, there are parts of it that you don't even really see as images that are much more gentrified. But the history of Hudson is so visible throughout, like in the town of Hudson itself and in the rural areas surrounding the town. This is on the Hudson River. I chose this image as the cover of the book because I felt like it incorporated some of the things I think are sort of crucial to understanding Hudson. It's the industrial history, it's the river, the significance of the river, and creating a seaport and a whale oil refinery, and eventually a sort of factory town in the 1800s, in the mountains, and just that, you quoted Allison talking about that light, and there was there's this very kind of northeastern somber light that I was interested, creating a palette that kind of stayed within that for this body of work. These are the Fergery fishing shacks, and they've existed for over 100 years, and it was a community of fishermen and hunters, and there are so many decades of stories in those shacks. And when I discovered them, I could just feel that power of their history. And there's been a lot of controversy in Hudson in recent years about whether to keep these shacks or tear them down. So preservationists are on the side of, this is the story of Hudson, this is sort of a landmark of Hudson history, and we should do something, we should preserve them. And then there are people who are like, these are an eyesore, this is a blight, we should tear this down, and so on. And that's still ongoing, actually, and there have been New York Times stories about that site in the past year. This image is on the left. That red brick building is a historic, that was actually one of the earliest buildings in Hudson. It's a whale oil refinery building, now just an empty building. But the houses next to it, I felt like, are so emblematic of these kind of clapboard northeastern houses that you see, that's ubiquitous throughout that region. So I wanted to just talk about something that's both very historic, but and also just a kind of everyday, ordinary, residential scene in this area. This white car. This is in downtown Hudson. Obviously, there was a humor for me of the juxtaposition of the car and the kind of quirky hairdresser sign. And I started this talk with talking about Hopper, and I think this of more than maybe any image is kind of referencing what I mean about like even before I started shooting in Hudson, I was always thinking there's such a Hopper-esque feel to this town, and this, you know, the space and the light and the kind of American architecture in this image really kind of connected to that Hopper tradition for me. This is one of the few portraits I had moved away from just doing. I'd done 2 strictly portrait projects in a row, and that over the course of more than half a decade, and I was ready to move back into photographing the landscape. But I did also want to show some of the human presence in this area now. He owns a little kind of junk shop, antique store, parallel to the very shishi block of Warren Street that runs through Hudson now. And just kind of finds old things and sells them, and is a very kind of charismatic, interesting person who people always, someone even today asked if he was a painter and whether it was a house painter or an artist, but he's just an interesting Hudson character. And again, these are scenes that are showing just very ordinary Northeastern residences. There's one of the many, either they're both still functional factories in the area and no longer functioning abandoned factory settings throughout the area. This is down near the train station in Hudson, and the train line that runs along the Hudson River connects New York City to Montreal. So this is actually very close to this kind of charming little train station right on the edge of the Hudson River. And this photograph is an interior of the Oliver Bronson house. It's the upstairs rear bedroom. This is a very historic home from the early 1800s that has been lived in by many tenants. Initially, this, Dr. Oliver Bronson was a very stately home. And it is now actually preserved by Hudson Historical Society. So this is one of a couple places that I actually had to get access to photograph and write to the Hudson Historical Society and ask for permission. And a lot of photographers actually taking pictures in here because it's such an interesting old house. But at this room in particular, like the layers of history that were communicated through the wallpaper were so interesting to me. This yellow house, this is one of the areas surrounding Hudson. So a number of these images are taken in Germantown, Livingston, and a couple other Stockport towns, very kind of small rural towns outside of Hudson. I always drove past this little house, and it just always resonated so strongly with me. And I think this of the body of work seems to be one of the images people connect to the most. And my father's theory about that was actually that there's something about that house that relates to our childhoods and even childhood stories. So this small house and the way that it almost seems to have a personality. And then of course there's this drama of the moment that I actually photographed it a number of times, like, taking notes on my phone, which I do, throughout my process just to kind of visualize things. And this is actually in the summer, and this is a summer storm. So when I set up the camera, it was just sort of normal blue sky, and this very dramatic storm cloud settled in, which made it so much more, interesting to me. And these are workman shacks that you see in a lot of these rural areas. So like workers who work the kind of, farms around Hudson. So these structures are potentially hundreds of years old, and there's a sense of the decay, but also looking at what's remaining, what are the artifacts. Like, I'm very interested in looking like what are the human artifacts that are left from people's experiences in these environments. Sumac branches. Sumac are kind of like the kudzu of the north, in the sense that they're technically weeds, but absolutely beautiful in my opinion. And you see them growing throughout the Northeast, and you'll see them in like kind of fields of red. And so I was trying to kind of cover or make sure that I captured a number of different things that felt like so essential to me to really kind of talk about this region, including these small diners, which you see throughout. And I photographed this during the summer. And his name is Mike, and he works in an auto shop north of Hudson along the river. There is a very well-known Paul Strand photograph that when I looked at him, I photographed him, I couldn't help but it's of a farm boy in rural France. And I told him, I said, you look like this very famous Paul Strand. Because we have cell phones now, I Googled it and showed it to him actually when I was making that portrait. And this is a site that appears from the front and back. This image is obviously on the back wall of the car, and that was another thing. These old cars in the north left in people's yards, these vintage cars are just another part of the landscape there that I felt really to tell the story of this area. You know, I had to include this, but there's another image in the book which shows the other side of the house on in this kind of overgrowth of a flowering tree sort of taking over for that side of the house. Oh, here it is right here. So I visited some of these sites over and over again, like and photographed them in different seasons, different types of light. And this is the third portrait, Peter, who's an artist, and he has lived in Brooklyn and is part of. There is a community in Hudson of creative people some of who are connected to New York City, and there's kind of a progressive community there. Are a lot of artists in the area. This is called Storm Clouds Over Fields. This is in Livingston. Again, that palette is what was the kind of dusk and the quality of light and the sense of the storm. And this is in Stockport. And another aspect, I think, of telling the story about rural America is the relationship that people have so intimately with death. And this is a small section of a yard that was just full of these dead carcasses, and that's obviously a common sight in much of rural America. And when I made the decision to work with a publishing company about September of last year, and I wanted to finish the project. I felt like it wasn't entirely done, so over winter break last year I finished it ahead of starting to design the book and the final edit. And the last few images that I felt like were important that I didn't have yet were more of these images of the kind of history of industrialization and that the decline of industrialization in that area. So I very consciously was seeking that in this kind of the last images that I was shooting. This is a view of the Hudson River taken from the Hudson side, looking at the Catskills. There's Catskill Mountains in the background. This vantage point is very similar to that of the Hudson School painters. So there a number, like Frederick Church, Thomas Cole are two of the famous painters of the Hudson's, that tradition in American painting. Thomas Cole's house is actually, like I've been there, Alana, and if you stand on the mountain and sort of look across the Hudson River, it's very similar to view to what I was trying to find, but I had to figure out a way to trespass into someone's yard to get to this point and to get that sort of vista. But I guess one of the differences between the Hudson River School is very much about idealizing nature and this very romantic depiction of the landscape. And I think this book is not so, there's not that level of romanticism, and that there's trying to also bring in the kind of the reality of these, the industrialization in that area, and there's sort of a different tone. In some of these pictures, time of day is probably one of the most important things to me about the process, and I got up very early in the morning. I would make some of these pictures like 5 or 6 a.m. to be able to get the quality of light that I was drawn to. And this and a couple other places I photographed no longer exist. This building has since burned down. It's on the edge of Hudson. So some of these images are capturing things that are changing, have been changing over time and enduring, and then may continue to change or even no longer endure. And those are, even the sense of endurance is part of what this work is about. And this is an interior of the Fergary Shack. That was another one I was kind of determined to get before I finished this project, to get inside. And this particular shack was the most interesting to me because of the very quirky artifacts left by this community within the. So that I've reached the end, and I'll if anybody wants to ask questions, I'm happy to answer them. Okay.
So with the portion of your work that's portraits, like on the streets and stuff, how
Yeah.
do you engage initially with these people?
I just basically, I have my camera bag on my shoulder, and then I would approach someone and introduce myself and say, I'm working on a portrait project, and whether it was Binghamton or Patterson, say I think you'd be a interesting person to photograph, and do you have some time? And then like I was saying before, I would try to mention something I notice about them to kind of validate them, because I think it helps, the fact that so many people are willing to be photographed speaks to the fact that there's something validating to people to be seen, to be noticed, and to be honored in the sense they're photographed. So to find some way to indicate that attraction to someone helps, kind of create a warmth and an interest on a subject's part to be photographed.
Do you have to get written approval?
So yeah, that's a good question. I did bring a kind of makeshift that I wrote myself, model release form, and then after I photographed people, I would say, I would make it kind of an option or a question, say, would you mind signing this form? It would just help me in terms of being able to exhibit this work. And people would obviously ask, what's, is this gonna be a newspaper? What is this? And I would just essentially say, this would be in a gallery exhibition potentially, or possibly a book, but not likely, this is not used for advertising, et cetera. And more often than not, I would also use that written information as a way to keep contact information for people. So I'd ask for their email address if they had one, phone number, some way that I could reach out. And then I would actually send people these images, or even when I was working in Patterson, I would make small prints and bring them back with me, and then when I would see people again, give them small prints and I spent so much time there over the years that people started to just be used to me being there and to know that I was working on a project, and to that happened more and more in time.
Do you find it harder to approach people now than maybe 15, 20 years ago?
Well, I did that work, the portraits within the past decade. Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. It can be helpful in some ways to have a cell phone, but also a hindrance in the sense that people are more, I guess, aware of the fact that images can immediately be posted online, or that a picture of them could be on social media, so there is more anxiety I think people have about, what's going to happen with this image. But yeah, it hasn't been so significant, but it has, definitely people are more conscious of the proliferation of imagery in our daily life.
You mentioned that you, at one point, that you were taking notes with your phone.
Yeah.
So I take notes on projects, but I've got a feeling the way you take notes is very different. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about the process and what that means, taking notes.
Okay, so when I'm driving around, I'll take snapshots on my cell phone of places just to even get a sense of composition and light, or even just to record that place. If I'm not photographing it now, I might go back to it. But just to be able to look at it, almost like the way photographers used to take a Polaroid and then look at it and then create their 4x5 image. I use my phone to kind of look at it and then think about, have a little visual sense. But then I would also just keep notes about, there's just notes in my cell phone about, there's this shack on Route 9 at the corner across from the church. You know what I mean? Just things to remember, to keep records of things that I wanted to photograph. All right. Any more? Yeah? You want to read the question? Oh, hey.
Excuse me, I have one question related to the second question. I'm new in Tennessee. When I go out, I find many buildings are wonderful, so I want to take pictures. I thought some of your pictures perhaps belong to private homes.
Belong to what?
Private.
I'm sorry. Private. Oh, yeah. All of the personal houses I photographed are, well, not all of them, actually. Like most of them are abandoned, or I'm photographing them from such a distance that I'm not really, people have come out of these homes when I've been photographing them, and it's not so intrusive because I'm further enough away. I'm actually literally across the street photographing this one and photographing that from the top of the hill. So it's not so close to people's homes that they would feel a sense of intrusion. Or, certainly over the years I've been photographing, people have come out a bit in play, been like, what are you doing? And then I explain to people more often than not, it's fine. But, even since I've started a new project down here, I do feel like I have to be cautious sometimes about it's so easy and tempting to want to just pull up, see something in someone's yard, but then to remember boundaries and dangers and things like that. Okay. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.